Hi, and welcome to the Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. We are living through momentous times and not in a good way. We're living through the darkest days in Europe since when? I don't know. 1956 maybe, when the Soviet Union crushed the Hungarian uprising. 1968 when they did it again, crushed the Czechoslovak, the Prague Spring. People will talk about 2025 like that, when Russia, freed from the Soviet state, but still essentially the Russian Empire, again saw its imperialism triumph, but triumph in a way none of us who grew up in the 20th century, or even the early 21st century, could ever have begun to expect. Grew up, Russian imperialism will have triumphed with the active support of America. It is an enormous betrayal, if it is a betrayal. We'll come to that in a minute. We'll come to whether we can be absolutely certain about what we're seeing unfold in front of us, beyond the fact that it is both extraordinary and treacherous and hugely, hugely worrying. I'm joined today from Kyiv because obviously the people of Ukraine are feeling this the most. I'm joined today from Kyiv by my old friend and colleague John Sweeney. God, Johnson, everything. He was a reporter on The Observer with me. He's been on Panorama. He's worked for everyone, and now he's a freelance foreign correspondent in Kyiv who gives daily updates on Twitter, which become a kind of must-watch for those of us looking on with increasingly horrified eyes. John, welcome to the Lowdown.
Hi, Nick. Pleasure to be here.
How are things in Kyiv now? What on earth are people thinking?
It's weird. And by the way, I was going to say it just feels like old times. Here we are in a kind of radio version of the Coach and Horses.
Yeah. That's I ought to explain to listeners who are lucky enough not to know what the Coach and Horses was. It was the Observer office pub.
and here we are again, putting the world to rights. Though I can't remember a bleaker moment. What's funny is that actually the mood here in I've been in Kyiv for the past week is hope burns bright. The country has come together behind Zelenskyy. Trump said Zelenskyy is a dictator, and then every single MP who voted in favor of continuing martial law because the Ukrainian opposition, and they're strong and forceful critics of Zelenskyy, are clear that having an election while they're fighting the Russians is not a smart thing to do. And there's an exact parallel with Britain did not have an election until the Nazis were defeated in the Second World War.
And Nazi propagandists I was reading today, John, Nazi propagandists in the Second World War said, you can tell Churchill's really a dictator because they've postponed the elections. It's exactly the same. Hitler's tactics, Putin's tactics are a perfect fit.
Yes, but it is what's so terrifying is not Putin's tactics. The fact that that Donald Trump, the leader of the Unfree world, is favoring the Russians over the Ukrainians, and and the phrase "Russia invaded Ukraine" is something that nobody in the court of King Donald dare say, and that's terrifying. But to answer your question, I went to the Titanium Clinic, was centre, part of the Myram Clinic, and it's a place where they're helping Ukrainian soldiers who've got very, very high amputations. So these are people where they're normal. You've got a stump, and then you stick a prosthesis on the stump. These chaps have got. Often they had a tourniquet. One of their mates puts a tourniquet on, but the fighting is heavy and they can't get medevaced out, and essentially they're stuck. And the tourniquet bites, and so they lose the entire limb. So very, very high amputations, and what they're left with is not a proper stump, but almost like a flap or a flipper. It's now. There's a very clever Swedish doctor who's taught the Ukrainians to do what's called osseointegration, which is fancy talk for kind of bone engineering. And what they do once the wound is healed properly, they drill into the wound and create a kind of a very comfortable socket for an entirely for a tin or plastic arm, a tin leg, etc. And they put electrodes not in the brain. That's very, very expensive and complicated. They put them in this new socket they've created.
Okay.
And that gives these guys control, and as they get used to the machinery and the bits and bobs, they get better at it. So I asked this guy Anton. He's lost one leg and both arms. So when he shakes my hand, his left hand's better than his right, but he's got black plastic fingers.
Right.
And he's got no limbs, no stumps to speak of at all, but this new clever osteo-integrated stuff. And his left hand is better than his. I'm going to do it with my right hand because it's complicated, but his left hand's better than his right hand. But I said, "What do you think to Donald Trump?" And he said, "Listen, I don't want to be undiplomatic. What do you think to Putin?" And he goes, "Wait." And he slowly takes down his little finger and the thumb, and then the that finger, and then his left, and it takes about a minute to do.
To give the finger.
Yeah, and he's got the middle finger. And
yeah.
I was on Good Morning Britain the other day with Susanna Reid because they were there for the third anniversary. And I told this story, and Susanna said, "But John, this is a family show, and that's an obscene gesture." Watch it. I do apologise. Now, listen, I don't want to. I love Susanna Reid. She's lovely, queued for the Queen, all that stuff, and I like my friends at Good Morning Britain. But it gives you a flavour of the slight weirdness. Britain is a good ally for Ukraine. That's true, but the idea that this would be a shocking thing here in Ukraine. Well, no.
So John, you're not getting, and this is a fair question, I think. You're not getting people in Ukraine after 3 years of war, horrific casualties, a front line where the Russians are having even worse casualties. It's something we don't talk about, what Putin has done to a whole generation of poor Russian men. But he's not stopping. They are making slow advances at terrible cost, but they're coming. You're not getting people saying, well, look, if Trump says, okay, let's freeze the war, let's have a frozen conflict like Korea, have our equivalent of the Korean demilitarized zone, come on, it's time to stop this. You're not getting people saying that in Kyiv, are you?
There will be people who will be happy with the frozen conflict because it gives, I mean, the soldiers or whatever, that's okay. They are not happy at all with Trump's language. The idea that Zelenskyy is dictator, Ukraine should not have started this war. They're really, really angry with that. And it's not the idea of a frozen conflict, or you freeze it along these lines. That's something I think quite a lot of Ukrainians would live with. In particular, because of conscription problems, because Ukraine's got a much smaller population than Russia. The soldiers have been pretty much on the front line for 3 years, so they're exhausted.
Yeah.
But there is a complete difference. And actually, Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, said this rather brilliantly on Newsnight. I'm going to borrow his language for it. But Trump thinks all Ukraine has to do is to trade land for peace and the war can stop. The problem is the Ukrainians fear that that's not what Vladimir Putin wants. Vladimir Putin wants a broken and crushed Ukraine under his thumb, with the Kremlin controlling who the leader of Ukraine is, so that Ukraine effectively becomes part of the Russian world, the Russian Empire. What does Ukrainians don't want?
What do you think Trump wants? Because people in Britain, including, I guess, former heads of MI6, you see them clutching at straws, and I'm not disparaging them in any way at all, because it is the idea of the American security guarantee going, the idea almost of America switching sides is just appalling. It's absolutely appalling. Militarily, Europe can't take it on. We're just not in a state to do it. But do you think that Trump is really going the way some of his rhetoric and some of his appalling lies suggest, and just giving Putin what he wants? Or do you think it might switch round a bit and he might give Ukraine more backing, more guarantees? How do you read him, or do you think he's unreadable?
He's difficult to read, but I'm pessimistic in that everything. So the taboo is you don't sit down with the Russians until you've sat down with the Ukrainians. He does it the wrong way around. So the Saudi talks, the United States and the Russians are present, the Ukrainians are not. He calls Zelenskyy a dictator. He says Ukraine should not have started this war. Russia invaded Ukraine. So all of that language is bad. The Ukrainians want to be part of NATO, which gives them a lasting security guarantee. By the way, and they can do that with the kind of North Korea, South Korea style frozen borders, but that's what they want. Hexham says that's not going to happen. Trump says that's not going to happen. So so the reason I'm pessimistic is all the signs are that Trump's already giving Putin what he wants, and he's
without asking for anything in return, John.
Yes,
so much
yes.
for the art of the bloody deal.
Yes, no, it's preposterous. And why is he doing this? Well, the polite version is that he admires strength more than anything else. He's not interested in rights or the proper way of doing things. He's thoroughly ignorant of history, and he doesn't understand that the generation of the First World War went to war because the Kaiser's Germany invaded and broke Belgian neutrality. And this was wrong. That's why Britain went to war in 1914. And then again, my father and his generation, they went to war against Nazi Germany in 1939 because they invaded Poland. Now, Russia invades Ukraine, and Russia should leave Ukraine. There's a whole set of sanctions up there. And it looks as though Trump's about to sort of unstick all those things. But by the way, you said something a little bit earlier, that Europe hasn't got enough stuff to make good the American firepower. That's not quite right.
All right.
Because and I've written about this for my Patreons, and it's, if you go on to, it's, anybody can read it. But essentially, the Ukrainians are doing far better than expected. And the drone warfare means that really neither side can move at all fast. So there can be no breakthroughs because the drones enable you to see any build-up. And both sides can react, and they have complete warning of what's happening. It's as if you've got 100% visibility of the enemy action, which is why the Russians have such fabulous losses. The problem, of course, is that Putin doesn't care about losses. But having said that, so the Ukrainians, I mean, the Russians still haven't taken Pokrovsk. You know, like, they still haven't taken the whole of the Donbass Oblast. Yes, they're inching away, but Ukraine is an enormous country. It's the biggest country in Europe. And the Ukrainians are doing very well. An excellent piece of news is that the glide bombs, it's the classic kind of World War II bomb from a plane. And what they've done, the Americans first, and now the Russians, is you put on an add-on kit with fins, which you can control, and a bit of a radio transmitter. And the bomb, when it's dropped out from the bomber, the bomb glides with these fins, and it's controlled, so it becomes a very, very cheap kind of cruise missile.
And Russia's been using them to great effect.
Yes, and they've been knocking out positions, trench systems, and that, for example, is one of the reasons why Ukraine lost Avdiivka, which is the last town before Pokrovsk. So the towns in Bakhmut, in the Donbass, were Bakhmut's gone, then Avdiivka, now Pokrovsk being fought. Now, what's happened is that the Ukrainians have done some brilliant electronic warfare stuff, and they have managed to fry and scramble the Russian glide bomb telemetry or signaling system. So the glide bombs are no longer controlled, and they're dropping into beetroot fields and forests. They're not hitting the places they're supposed to be hitting, which is a huge relief for the Ukrainians. Secondly, obviously, the Patriot missiles, these are these very expensive defense missiles, which the Americans have given to Ukraine, and they've allowed they have stopped Russian missile attacks landing in Kyiv. And that was the case from October. They started on October I think it was October the 18th, 2022. And there were a lot of cruise missiles, and they were knocked out by these Patriot missiles. Now the Ukrainians are stockpiling the missiles, and so what you get is a different soundscape to the evening or the night. What's happening now is that the Russians have actually run out of all of their big missiles. They've just used a lot. So what they now do is send Iranian Shahed, which are kind of big. They look like a big dinner table, but like a triangle of a dinner table, and there's got a rotor at the back, powered by two moped engines. So they sound like rubbish mopeds in the sky.
Okay.
And they're not, so knocking those things out with a Patriot missile is a waste of money, and the Ukrainians are hoarding their Patriot missiles for a rainy day. So what they're now doing is using German machine gun, a very fancy German machine gun unit, I have to say, but it's a machine gun, which the Germans are supplying and very happy to. Remember, the positive is that Scholz has gone, thank God, and the new guy, Merz, is good. And so for example, last night about 4 o'clock, you hear bang, 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 bang. This is Ukrainian Ak taking out the Shahed.
Okay.
It used to hear a kind of big explosion, and now it's Ak. It's kind of more old-fashioned and very fucking noisy, but it's effective and it works. Since I've been in Kyiv, the center of Kyiv, for a week, and I've heard bang bangs. I haven't seen any damage myself. It's true to say that on the edges, so for example in Bucha, which is the northwest of the city, Hendon, in London terms, if I'm pretty much in Westminster, Hendon got hit, and a surgeon, a cancer surgeon, and his wife, a journalist, so two people were killed.
Oh, God.
By a Russian drone 2 days ago.
Oh, dear.
However, the city, the center of the city, is more or less safe. So, the other thing is, although Biden was wrong to be too timid to drip feed aid to Ukraine because fear of a bluster from the killer, nuclear bluster from the killer in the Kremlin, it's absolutely true to say that the Biden administration sent a lot, commissioned and signed off on about a year's worth of American military aid. So that they've got the stocks, they've stopped the glide bombs. It's very difficult for the Russians to move forward, and they have the Ukrainians are doing well with the rocket war. And they're now coming up with a replacement for Starlink. So all of the things that and Trump, because he doesn't command detail at all, he's a foolish and ignorant man. He's not working out that actually the Ukrainians are militarily stronger. Now, what's quite likely, I think, is that Trump will sabotage Western sanctions against Russia, but that won't have an immediate effect on the battlefield. So although people are disgusted with Trump, it's not game over here.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Our guest this week is John Sweeney, star reporter, ace reporter, and our man in Kyiv. John, you wrote a very good book, actually, called The Killer in the Kremlin, about Putin.
By the way, Nick, why do you sound so surprised?
I was astonished. I could barely put it down. I thought, my God, who's written? I kept checking. John Sweeney, surely not. John, look, can I just put to you a conspiracy theory? Centrists can have conspiracy theories as well. There's no immunity. But do you think that the Russians have something on Trump? Because it is so extraordinary what's happening. It is so extraordinary. And you talked a minute ago about Trump, the big thing coming from, well, they are far right, and I'll defend the use of the term far right to describe the Republicans in Washington now. They don't believe in fair elections. They don't accept election results. So that's not far right. What the bloody hell is? But as soon as you say, "Oh, Trump will want to drop the sanctions," I think money will change hands to Trump and his team. You can guarantee that. I mean, do you actually believe in this whole Mueller report, all the conspiracy theories around the Mueller report from the late from his first term? I mean, do you think that they have something on him, or is that just, if you like, centrist paranoid gibbering?
No, I think the Mueller report was accurate and thorough and detailed in its explanation that Russian bots and Russian money and Russian hacking helped the Republicans to the detriment of the Democrats in 2016. Secondly, I know Christopher Steele well. He's a friend of mine. I've read his book, which is published in America, unredacted. And what Chris says in the book, he wrote the Steele dossier. Remember, this report was never ever meant to hit the public.
Yes, I ought to just explain to listeners. Christopher Steele was an ex-MI6 agent, I think, who just got the evidence together of Russian, not just Russian campaigning for Trump, but Russian influence over Trump.
Yes, and but the specific thing in Chris's report was that there'd been some kind of show where prostitutes urinated, possibly on. I don't know. There's a bit of detail about this, which isn't in all the paperwork. That it may have been a black prostitute who was playing Michelle Obama. This is dark stuff. Now,
it is. But I should say, unlike This Morning with Suzanne Reid, this is not a family podcast.
Yeah, yes. I listen. Good Morning Britain.
Good Morning Britain, whatever it's called. Yeah.
It's a nice old show. But this now, Chris can't prove it, but he's got good sources and he knows his stuff. So, and the problem is, until the Kremlin releases its files, then we won't know. And just so that everybody's listening can work this out, if you ask the wrong kind of questions in Russia, you may die. So, for Putin critics, I know, Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny, in order: poison, then shot, poison, recovered, poisoned, killed. So if you ask these questions, you try and get to the bottom of what's happening inside the Russian dark state, you have a very good chance of being murdered or falling out of the fifth floor window or drinking the wrong kind of tea. And by the way, that tells you something about the Russian system. So Trump's behavior is, at the moment, he's gifting a whole series of things to the Russians who are the guilty party. No question. And that makes no sense. It's a rubbish deal to say, let's try and stop this war. And what the first thing we should do is meet with the guilty party, with the invaders, not the invaded first. That we should ignore what the invaded, the innocent party wants, which is a security, because they've signed lots of fucking peace deals with the Russians. Putin himself said, "We're not going to invade." What happens? They invade. I mean, the Ukrainians don't trust the Russians, and they're right to do so. Trump is a fool for doing this. The question is he just he's certainly a fool, but have they got something on him? And my, as I said, Chris's problem is he had sources. Remember, this was never meant for public consumption. And this is what his sources said. And he felt it was professional to report what his sources were telling him to his clients. But just because Chris can't prove it, and I've explained, you try and ask these questions,
and you end up dead.
Yeah. So that's the difficulty. But I side with Chris's reporting, and I think it more likely than not that the Russians have some compromising material on Donald Trump. And by the way, the often question is, well, like him shagging a 24-year-old, who gives a fuck about that? Yeah, it's terrific. The Russian dark state is good at what it does. So it won't be a kind of, two consenting adults having the joy of sex together. It'll be something dark and horrible and embarrassing. For example, there's another story we couldn't prove when I looked at it for BBC Panorama, but Putin had a Russian mistress around about the turn of the millennium who was a Miss Universe contender, and she lived in Trump Tower as, I think, Trump's mistress for a time. And the gossip was that she became pregnant, and then she was no longer pregnant. So
right.
It's possible, and I can't prove it, it's possible that she may have carried Trump's baby, and then there was an abortion. Now, that's the kind of thing which would damage Trump's standing with evangelicals.
We interviewed on this podcast, we interviewed some Swedish investigative journalists, some Scandinavian investigative journalists, who had looked how a Scandinavian bank had been corrupted by the Russians, turned into a money laundering centre. And they told the story of one of the bank executives who went to Moscow in 2003, I think it was. And there's a honey trap set up for him. And I said, well, why? I said, so why to the journalists who'd done a ton of work, they'd had all kinds of threats, they'd real proper hero investigative journalists. And they just said, well, look, Nick, that's what Russia at that time, when Putin's coming into his pomp, you are a senior figure from the West. You go to Moscow, they will try something, and they'll try it just to keep it in the bank. It's no good if you say to them, if you say to me, why would they do that at that point? What could they hope to gain? It's the wrong question. They're always looking for compromise, looking for material, and then just filing it away and saying, well, perhaps one day we can use that.
Yes.
It's incessant, in other words, John.
Yes. Now, I also think that Trump doesn't have a democratic bone in his body. He likes naked power. He is a bully. He likes strength, not weakness. He doesn't understand the idea of restraint. But if you're powerful, you should act with restraint. He doesn't get any of those things, or the nature of checks and balances and the importance of checks and balances in a liberal democracy. He doesn't like any of that stuff. So I think he is in genuine sympathy with Putin's project. Now, I was at the Observer when I reported upon the fall of the Eastern European Warsaw Pact Soviets, embedded dictatorships, the one in Czechoslovakia, and then the Romanian Revolution. And bliss was it in that morning to be alive. And we all thought that what would happen was, although Russia was obviously slower and a harder nut to crack, but over time it would become more free, more democratic, more easygoing. And after 10 years of chaos under Yeltsin, Putin struggled to the top, and then everything went back into the Soviet shadow, into Soviet gloom. Okay, different name, Russia, not the Soviet Union, but essentially a continuation of a kind of KGBocracy. That's what Putin runs in Russia. And the striking thing about this is, no, the West didn't westernize Russia. We didn't democratize Russia. Russia is poisoning the West.
Oh, absolutely.
Russia has Russianized the United States, and rather than export democracy to the East has exported corruption and the poisoning of the Western mind from Moscow, and Moscow has managed to capture the man in the White House. Now, again, I think that's a fact. Can I prove the motivation is down to corruption and control? No. And I think that Donald Trump has, I think there is some compromise on him. I do. But I actually don't think that's the thing that's driving him completely.
He would do it anyway.
He would do it anyway, but there's something he knows that if he doesn't do it, he's in trouble. So therefore, he is a willing participant of this nonsense, and the dark nonsense.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Our guest this week is John Sweeney, foreign correspondent, war correspondent, author. He's just done everything. But most of all, in the past 3 years, he has constantly focused on the crucial battle for Europe's future in Ukraine, and he's joining us from Kyiv. John, could I just ask you, can we just go back to Russia for a moment? One of the problems, because as you say, you try and do proper journalism in Russia, you end up dead. You try and do proper oppositional politics in Russia, you end up dead. So we constantly see Russia as this monolith, this grim, increasingly totalitarian, increasingly, well, yeah, that's not an extreme word to throw around, monolith. And yet Putin has imposed appalling costs on his society for a special military operation, as he laughingly called it, that was meant to be over in days. It's lasted 3 years. The Ministry of Defense estimates on Russian casualties are just extraordinary. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people dead, injured, captured. The economy finally, inflation taking off. Has Trump just come to Putin's rescue just in time? Can Putin survive all of this? You constantly keep thinking. I constantly keep thinking, what is it we can't see? What's out there that we don't know? And we don't really know what's going on inside the Russian elite, how tolerant they will be of all of this, and for how long.
Well, that's a very, very good question. My last so after killing the Kremlin, I read another book about a British guy who was fighting with the Ukrainians under military contract, not a mercenary, with the Ukrainian Marines, and he was captured in Mariupol, tortured, subjected to mock execution, a trial where he was sentenced to death, and eventually traded for a pro-Kremlin Ukrainian oligarch. And then last year, I wrote a book called Murder in the Gulag about Navalny. And Navalny was Russia's great hope. Extraordinarily brave man. And listen, he had a flirtation with the far right from 2007 to 2010. And because he was desperate to be a credible opponent to Putin, he didn't burn his bridges with the far right in a way that he should have done. But nevertheless, when push came to shove, he said, the war is wrong. Russia should respect the 1991 boundaries, i.e., Crimea is Ukrainian, all of that. Navalny's murder was a terrible thing. And what was so depressing was there was no comment from Trump or Musk. They're all getting upset because this far right in Romania has been arrested and his bodyguard has got $10 million in cash on him. Okay. But what about Navalny, who was murdered? And, the idea that Zelenskyy is a dictator, that's ridiculous. Putin's a dictator. Putin's problem is that he has changed. There was a moment in 2012 when he did the switcheroo. Remember, he'd been in power for Russian presidential term at that point was 4 years long. He had 2 terms from 2000 to 2008. Then what happens is his prime minister, Medvedev, who gets the job because he's about an inch shorter than Putin, who himself is a short man. So imagine that your only qualification is being shorter than the boss. But Medvedev becomes the president. Really, real power resides with Putin. It's a con. After 4 years of Medvedev in power, Medvedev announces a switcheroo, and the new president will be Vladimir Putin. Navalny calls everybody out in the streets, and maybe 100,000, maybe 200,000 people hit the streets that December 2012. And it's a lot of people. The biggest protests against Putin since, outside the Kremlin, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And what's interesting is that Putin doesn't kill Navalny there and then because he fears him, and he's not that strong. It's only after he starts the big war when the plight of one Russian opposition leader, or the Russian opposition leader, it kind of becomes less important in how the world thinks.
It's interesting. I was fortunate on this, rather forgotten now, but when Prigozhin, the hideous war criminal mercenary boss, he revolts against Putin about the conduct of the war, and his forces, which aren't, they're not full armored brigades with air support or anything. They're able to walk into Rostov-on-Don and everyone welcomes them, and then get hundreds of kilometers up the road to Moscow before they're stopped. I mean, it does feel, on the one hand, as people used to say about the old dictatorships of the 20th century, on the one hand, they're very firm, they're solid, they're terrible, but in their strength, there's awful brittleness. That these things can fall apart quite easily.
Not a single secret policeman in Rostov raised a finger to stop Prigozhin's mutiny from succeeding there. Not a single secret policeman. So Putin is far weaker. Weirdly, it's possible that this, if Russia morphs towards or if there is some kind of peace deal where the fighting stops, then some of the Russians will sort of look up and wake up and go, "What the hell is going on here?" The problem I have with the peace talks and Trump's conception of them is that this is a peace with the peace he envisages is the peace with Vladimir Putin's smiling face on it, and that's unacceptable to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't trust Putin because he invaded them, having said he wouldn't, and therefore they want security guarantees. They want to be in NATO. And if Trump doesn't deliver that or fucks that up, and at the moment he's neither promising he's absolutely promising not to deliver that, and he's sending out a whole series of messages which undermine the entire Western world's hostile stance towards Russia, sanctions, etc. Trump is undermining all of that right now before the negotiations start, and the negotiations started with the Americans talking to the Russians, and today they're talking about embassy to embassy stuff. Now, what's happened is that the Russians are being invited back from the cold before they've conceded a single thing.
It is so sickening. It is absolutely, because we can talk. You and I can talk, not wholly in Western liberal fantasy, about the strains the Putin regime is under, how it's been a disaster for Russians. We haven't even mentioned how Putin, supposedly the great Russian chauvinist, has sold Russia to China at bargain basement prices, which, if you were a Russian patriot, would really bother you. But all the time, and then here is Trump, like some hideously obese cowboy on his nag, coming over the horizon to save Putin's bacon.
Yes. By the way, so I can't see the peace talks or the peace deal being accepted by the Ukrainians. And as I've said earlier, the military position of the Ukrainians is stronger than Trump can see. But remember, Trump had bone spurs, so he's got no experience of actual fighting.
Yeah.
And the people Hegseth, who's the defense secretary, is a gob on a stick from Fox News. He isn't a proper general in any sense. And the deputy was dumbstruck when asked by Democrats a simple question: did Russia invade Ukraine? And he wouldn't answer it because you can't say that there. But as to Putin, I think the danger is if there is a ceasefire, then Russia might wake up to the appalling costs in both treasure and, more importantly, in blood Russia has paid for what? The other thing is that I think even, and Trump doesn't properly get this, but the Europeans, and in particular the people who lived in Eastern Europe, are the closer you live to the Russians, the more you understand them, the more you fear them, the more you really want to help Ukraine. Now, the exception, I think, well, both Britain and France are good on this, and now Germany's getting much, much better. So my view is that the Europeans have got about a year, maybe more, but the Ukrainians have got about a year before they're going to suffer the American military withholding. And there's something else, is that if Trump does succeed in favoring Russia over Ukraine and the Ukrainian front collapses, and that's not going to happen anytime soon, but it could happen in a year's time, say. If that happens, then it will be a Trump's version of Biden's tragic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And remember, by the way, it's Trump who did a terrible deal with the
yes, that's a very important point. Once again, it's amazing how, I mean, Francis Wheen, great author, private eye editor, always used to say, whatever people think about a politician, whatever the wrong cliche they say about a politician, it's never true. And with Trump, everyone says, yeah, he's transactional, he's a great deal maker. No, he's not. No, he's not. He absolutely folded. His way of making a deal for the Taliban was say, what do you want? I'll give it all to you. His way of making a deal with Russia is say, I will give you everything even before you've offered me anything in return.
So I think if there is, I'm skeptical that the Ukrainians will accept peace. But if there is a peace, or at least the conflict's frozen, then there is a danger for Putin of the Russians waking up from their nightmare and asking, what's happened here? But by the way, there's something else as well, which is interesting, is that the stock of Rheinmetall, the big German defense contractor, is going through the roof. American military stock is dropping. Tesla is tanking.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that
John, Europe can do this if we've got the political will.
Yeah.
I mean, what's Russia? It's a corrupt, decrepit mafia state, as its old pre-Trump State Department used to say. Of course we can arm Ukraine if we want
to. And actually, it's more about money, because the Ukrainians are making their own things and they're getting better and better at it.
Yeah.
Now the Russians are they keep on cranking up their drone production, but I think last year somebody told me the Ukrainians they went from producing 1 million drones to 2 million drones. Now they're producing 4 million. So the Ukrainians are really, really on it. But what Trump has and his weird sidekick, Elon Musk, who's really crazy.
Oh, I know.
What they don't get is that actually there is a kind of welfare state in the United States, and that welfare state benefits an awful lot of Republicans. And what they're doing is, by taking an axe to the whole thing, they're thinking that they're getting at the Democrats, but actually they're hurting their own people.
Mm.
So I can, and this is deeply unpopular in the United States. So the reason why I'm a bit of an optimist, and you can call me a fool for this, is that militarily, the front can't change very fast, and the Ukrainians are very good. And by the way, just a little bit of history here. So Trump's view and J.D.Vance's view is Ukraine should not have started it, and what they're talking about is NATO's the NATO shield forever.
Eastward expansion, yeah.
Yeah, but okay, so let's respect the map before. Well, who drew up that map? I'll tell you, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. And what George Orwell calls the midnight of the century, the Nazis.
I'm sorry. We have a lot of distant Marxists who listen to this show. All three of them in Britain. It wasn't George Orwell. It was Victor Serge, who wrote a wonderful novel called Midnight of the Century about people in the Siberian camps.
Then I doff my cap to Victor Serge, and I haven't read that book. And my favourite book actually is Darkness at Noon, or one of my But I'm anyway. So the Nazi-Soviet pact redrew the map of Europe by two dictators, and guess what? Guess what? The people who live in those countries, for example, Poland and the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, don't like a map drawn up by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, which crushed their countries and obliterated them. They don't like that. So part of the historical ignorance of Team Trump is to assume that the Russians, it's fine and proper to go back to that map, which was actually half drawn up by Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, John, we're going to have to wind this up in a moment, but I have to say, I did an instant post on my Substack as soon as Trump's deal with Putin came out. What was it? Going back 2 weeks now. My first thought was this will be the midnight of the 21st century. Everyone was comparing it to Munich because J.D.Vance was going to Munich and lying for his teeth and saying the real enemy isn't Russia or China, it's liberals. Important. This is like Munich in 1938. I said, no, this is not like Munich. This is because Chamberlain didn't want to give in to Hitler. Chamberlain hated Hitler. This is the modern equivalent of the Nazi-Soviet pact. This is a modern equivalent of the midnight of the 20th century, because you've got two essentially dictatorial leaders partitioning a continent like colonial overlords.
Yes, and that's that is the far better historical analogy. So the reason I'm an optimist is because Ukraine, the military position won't move dramatically for at least a year. The Germans and the Poles and the Eastern Europeans and the British and the French all support Ukraine, and that's serious. As do the Dutch, as do the Italians, but also Trump's domestic program is about to really hit the metal barriers.
Another thing you haven't mentioned, John, is worth to say is Wall Street. You can never predict bubble markets in advance, but my God, if there's a Wall Street crash, no one will be remotely surprised. If there's a cryptocurrency crash, no one will be surprised. And Trump is absolutely personally involved in crypto scams in the bubble market, and I think anything like that would absolutely destroy his credibility with those voters who vote for him because they think, oh, Trump knows what he's doing with the economy.
Yes. So, but you can see that happening right now. I mean, Wall Street is not liking what he's doing. Ordinary Republicans don't like their welfare states, which isn't very. it's not as advanced as ours, but Trump and Musk are taking it apart in a way that is harsh and foolish. So Trump's domestic project I think, is about to getting into serious trouble, and at the same time, his international project is foolish, and the Ukrainians have got enough ammo and enough strength, exhausted as they are, to see through this, and hopefully that Trump's energy will be reduced and reduced and reduced.
Well, and the eye of Sauron will turn elsewhere.
Well, there's a simple point, and it's this, is that America first and American power are not easy bedfellows. If he's serious about American power, and that's something that Wall Street watches, then he's got to junk some of this America first rubbish. If he carries on with this, America will look weak, and its weakness will also be reflected in the economic numbers, and that's trouble for them. So grim as these days are, I still retain a little optimism.
On that genuinely uplifting and I would say rather surprising note, I wasn't expecting to hear what John said when we began this interview. I must draw it to a close. Thank you so much, John Sweeney, for joining us. Your books are available on Amazon and all good bookshops.
Yes.
Killer in the Kremlin, I think, is a great read, as I said, much to my surprise earlier. It really is, and a relevant read, I would have thought.
Yes, but also Murder in the Gulag, about Navalny, and you've got to read Navalny's great book, A Patriot. But mine's more warts and all, but it tells you a simple message: don't trust Vladimir Putin.
No,
don't be a fool.
Right. If you like this podcast, please give us a nice review, 5 stars, or write some nice words about us on your Apple, Spotify, Amazon, whatever app you listen to. If you like my stuff, you can read me on Substack, writing from London. Just Google Nick Cohen Substack. The producer was the great Andrew Hoskin. Now, Andy will be complaining that this podcast has gone on far too long. I can hear his voice now. I would say in mitigation, not really defense, yes, mitigation. 1, John has been a fascinating guest. 2, as Andy and everyone who knows John well, he is impossible to shut up. My name is Nick Cohen. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.